Most people think legacies are built on love or sacrifice. In my family, they're built on property lines, offshore accounts, and the size of your wine cellar. The Ellerbys have ruled Riverbend's real estate scene for 3 generations, each more polished and cutthroat than the last. My father, Clayton Ellerby, sits at the top of that empire like a self-appointed monarch, his smile as sharp as his contracts. His younger brother Marvin follows a few steps behind, loyal and lethal in equal measure. Between the two of them, they've carved our town into parcels of profit, erecting condominiums where forests once stood, evicting families with the flick of a pen. And then there's me, Nate. Nathaniel Ellerby, the grandson who catalogs microfilm and files declassified letters for a university archive no one in my family has set foot in. At gatherings, they call me the librarian, with that particular tone that suggests I've joined a priesthood of irrelevance. My cousin Lyle once joked that I should start charging overdue fines at Thanksgiving dinner. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. That's the rule, laugh and keep clearing the dishes. Our family dinners are spectacles, white tablecloths, silver forks that could slice your ego in half, and voices that carry across marble floors. Marvin talks about bidding wars. Clayton brags about city council favors. My cousins, all perfectly molded in ambition trade stories about luxury gyms and passive income streams like baseball cards. No one ever asks what I'm working on. They don't ask anything, really. I refill glasses, carve the roast, and wait for someone to see me. No one does. Once, years ago, I tried to share a story from the archive, an old Cold War letter between 2 operatives I'd uncovered, faded and cryptic beautiful in its restraint. I barely made it 2 sentences in before Marvin interrupted with a toast to a new shopping complex he'd broken ground on. My dad nodded approvingly. "That's what builds legacies," he said, raising his glass. "Not paper pushing in a dusty basement." I excused myself, went to the kitchen, and washed dishes I hadn't used. It was quieter there. Still, I came back every year. Not out of hope exactly, but duty. Someone had to remember that family didn't always mean dominance, and there was one place, only one, where I never felt erased. Every Saturday I drove the winding road past the edge of Riverbend, where the pavement broke into gravel and the trees thickened around the curves. My grandparents' house sat at the end of a lane that barely existed on maps, a wooden frame weathered by decades of seasons, its shutters slightly crooked, its porch sagging like a tired smile. It didn't look like much, especially compared to the Ellerby estates with their iron gates and imported landscaping, but it was the only place where the air didn't press in on me. Grandpa Walt would always be waiting on the porch, a cup of black coffee in one hand and a book in the other. He wore the same threadbare cardigan, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs, and a cap so faded you could barely see the university logo stitched on top. He'd wave once, then return to his page as if my arrival were expected but not disruptive. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish and wood smoke. Grandma June would bustle out of the kitchen with a dish towel over her shoulder and a tin of oatmeal cookies she insisted were fresh, even though I knew they were from the freezer. Her hands were soft, always patting mine as she led me to the couch beside the fire. She'd sit close enough to rest her shoulder against mine and hum when Grandpa started talking. His stories always began the same way, some dusty memory about Berlin or Budapest, cold alleyways, strange accents, meetings that happened in silence. Back when things were black and white and no one knew which side would break first, he'd say. My cousins called them fairy tales. My father called them delusions. But I listened. And sometimes when Grandma stepped out of the room and the fire cracked low, Grandpa's tone would shift. He'd lean in slightly, eyes fixed on mine, and say, "You know, Nathaniel, people lived 2 lives back then. One the world saw, and one they never spoke of. I did too. I never knew what to say, so I just nodded." One evening, just as I reached for another cookie, he looked at me differently, quiet, serious. "You're the only one I trust." I didn't know why he said it, not then. But I remembered, and I remembered again when the will was read. The conference room smelled like cologne and polished wood. Every Ellerby in the region had shown up dressed like they were attending an auction instead of a will reading. My father sat at the head of the long table, arms crossed, jaw-set eyes, scanning the lawyer like he was reading a contract he already planned to renegotiate. Uncle Marvin tapped his pen against his knee. My cousins whispered, grinned, checked their watches. I sat near the back between a coat rack and a water cooler. I didn't expect anything, not really. Grandpa didn't have money in the way the rest of them did. What he had was time, memory, and silence, the kind of inheritance you can't itemize. Harold Stein, the family lawyer, read slowly. A few savings accounts, small gifts to nieces and nephews, the old Pontiac to one of my cousins who barely remembered the man. Then he said my name. To Nathaniel Ellerby, Harold began pausing just long enough for heads to turn Walter Leaves' property number 431 and a cash sum of $50. The room went still for a second. Then the laughter broke out like a dropped glass. Jake clapped his hand against the table. Emily snorted. Marvin muttered something under his breath that made Dad smirk. My father didn't laugh. He leaned back in his chair and looked right at me. "Well," he said, "enjoy your glorified shed." I didn't respond. I didn't ask what Property 431 even was. I just nodded once and waited for the meeting to end. When the room emptied, I stayed behind and asked Harold for clarification. He handed me an envelope. Inside was the address and a crisp $50 bill folded once the serial number still sharp in the crease. No explanation, no message. I stepped out into the cold and stood on the sidewalk for a long time. The others were already pulling away in their cars, voices raised behind tinted glass. I held the bill in my hand, turning it slowly under the streetlight. It meant nothing, except it didn't. That night I didn't go home. I drove north toward the river. The $50 bill stayed in my coat pocket the whole drive. I couldn't say why I kept reaching for it, smoothing it flat, then folding it again along the original crease. It didn't feel like money. It felt like a breadcrumb. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the serial number for what felt like hours. Then I typed it into a search bar. Nothing came up at first, just unrelated listings, a few eBay notes, but the second half of the number matched something else buried in a dated zoning record. Property 431. A structure listed as condemned. The address, 318 Old Quarry Road, just a few miles past the Susquehanna's Bend. I left before sunrise. The road was more gravel than pavement, lined with frost-bitten trees and abandoned mailboxes. It felt like I was leaving the present entirely. When I reached the lot, the mailbox was gone, the numbers scratched into the leaning post like a half-erased memory. The house, or what was left of it, stood behind a sagging fence and a mess of overgrown brush. It wasn't large. It wasn't anything, really. Just a box of weathered wood with half a roof, one shutter, and a rusted lock that had long since stopped doing its job. The padlock broke off with one twist. Inside, the air was thick with dust and cold. The floor creaked under my feet, and the corners of the room were swallowed in shadows. Empty shelves, a broken chair, the remains of a sink. Nothing else. I stood in the center of the room, confused, frustrated, the ridiculous bill still in my hand. Then I heard it a faint hollow echo beneath my heel. I stepped back and tapped again. The board moved. I crouched down, hands shaking more from anticipation than cold, and pried at the wood. It lifted with a groan, revealing a small hatch metal, bolted with a combination lock almost invisible in the floorboard's grain. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. The $50 bill rested in my palm, its serial number catching the light. I entered the numbers slowly. The lock clicked. The hatch creaked open on stiff hinges, revealing a narrow wooden staircase swallowed by darkness. The smell hit me first earth rust and something older like forgotten air. I switched on my phone flashlight and stepped down one hand, skimming the wall for balance. Each board groaned under my weight, the kind of sound that warned you to turn around. I didn't. The cellar was small, just a concrete room with low ceilings and stone walls. A single wooden table stood in the center, its surface coated in dust. On it sat a metal lockbox, a black leather-bound notebook, and a small plastic bag containing a USB drive sealed tight like it hadn't been touched in years. I moved slowly, afraid even my breath would disturb something sacred. I opened the notebook first. The handwriting was my grandfather's neat, compact, unflinching. Each page held coded diagrams, location lists, operation titles. Some were labeled with cities I'd only read about in textbooks: Leipzig, Riga, Bucharest. The years ranged from 1972 to 1987. There were phrases I didn't fully understand: rendezvous compromised, handler replaced, asset extracted. Names were shortened to initials. One entry simply read, Met K. Operation sustained. Defection successful. At the bottom of several pages there was a signature, small, consistent, and chilling falcon. I turned to the metal box. Inside were folded documents stamped with fading government seals. Some pages bore official letterheads from U.S. agencies. One form, partly redacted, listed Walter Edmund Ellerby as a strategic coordinator for European operations. The document outlined tasks ranging from surveillance mapping to managing asset channels through embassy corridors. I sat down on the cellar floor, the weight of it all pressing against my ribs. My grandfather Walt, who wore mismatched socks and always over-buttered his toast, had run covert operations during the Cold War. Not just a participant, but someone who led. I picked up the USB drive, holding it like a relic. Whatever was inside it had been waiting quiet, undisturbed until now. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and took one last look at the cellar before climbing the stairs. Back in the daylight, the world felt louder, too bright, too present. I didn't know what to do with any of it yet, but I knew this wasn't just about history. It was about family, and I hadn't even opened the safe. I didn't sleep that night. The USB drive sat on my desk like it was breathing. I must have stared at it for hours before I finally plugged it into my laptop. A folder opened instantly labeled WEC Archive. Inside were PDFs, spreadsheets, scans of invoices, and something that stopped me cold, a video file titled For Nathaniel. I didn't watch it. Not yet. I started with the documents. The files were methodical, dated over nearly a decade. Grandpa had tracked a network of financial movements tied to a non-profit called Riverbend Futures, a charity I vaguely remembered being praised at a family Christmas party. It was supposed to fund housing for low-income families, but the numbers didn't add up. Deposits moved in, filtered through shell companies, and landed in Ellerby Holdings, accounts private jets, land acquisitions, luxury condos. Clayton's name appeared on internal memos, digital signatures on donations and authorization forms. Marvin's was scribbled across balance transfers and suspicious receipts. There were even emails carefully captured and time-stamped where they joked about sweetening the permits and moving ghost funds before audits. I felt sick. Then I opened the letter. It was handwritten, dated the year before Grandpa died. Nathaniel, if you're reading this, I trust you've found the place and the truth. I didn't come by this information easily. I watched my sons for years, hoping I was wrong, but I wasn't. I couldn't bring myself to turn them in. I still saw the boys I held in my arms once, not the men they became. I leave it to you. You've always seen the world differently, clearly. Do what you think is right. I couldn't. But maybe you can. Walt. I folded the letter and placed it beside the notebook. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from grief. My grandfather had buried the evidence and his heartbreak with me. I looked again at the file titled, "For Nathaniel," and pressed play. The next morning I walked into my father's office carrying a manila envelope. I hadn't called ahead. I didn't want to give them time to prepare. The receptionist gave me a hesitant smile but didn't stop me. Everyone in the building had always assumed I was harmless. My father sat at the head of the conference table, a thick binder open in front of him. Uncle Marvin stood near the window phone in hand, staring out over downtown Riverbend like he owned the skyline. They both looked up when I entered. "Nathaniel," my father said flatly, "you're not on the schedule." "I'm not here for a meeting," I said, and placed the envelope in front of him. He glanced at it, then at me. Marvin's phone lowered slowly from his ear. I didn't sit down. "What is this?" my father asked, already annoyed. "Evidence," I said, "of what you've been doing through Riverbend Futures, money laundering, shell companies, fake contracts." Grandpa knew. He documented everything. The room dropped into silence. Marvin stepped forward, opened the envelope, scanned the top page, then threw it onto the table. "This is garbage," he snapped. "You have no idea what you're looking at." My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You think you can walk in here with your grandfather's bedtime stories and accuse us of crimes?" "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm informing. You have one chance to shut it down. Quietly. Permanently. Return what you took. Dissolve the charity. Otherwise, I go public." They both laughed. Real laughter, loud, condescending, sharp-edged. "You think anyone's going to believe the dropout librarian," Marvin said. "We built this company. You've never built anything." "You're nothing," my father added. "Always on the outside, and this is why. You don't understand what it takes to hold power." I stood still. I'd imagined I'd be shaking, folding under their contempt. But I wasn't. I felt calm. "I don't want power," I said. "I want to sleep at night." Marvin stepped closer. "If you take this outside this room, you're done. You'll ruin your name, your job, everything." I looked him in the eye. "You already did that." I turned and walked out, the sound of their voices rising behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. I had already made the call to the reporter. The article hit the front page 2 days later. "Local real estate moguls accused of laundering millions through fake housing charity." My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the family knew. The documents were too specific, the timing too precise. That same afternoon, I sat with Harold Stein in his office as federal agents raided Ellerby Holdings. He didn't say much, just reviewed the chain of custody forms and nodded occasionally as if he'd always known this would come. By nightfall, the phones started ringing. Jake called first, shouting. Emily texted 3 paragraphs of venom. Marvin sent a single sentence, "You have no idea what you've done." I didn't answer any of them. My father didn't call at all. Instead, my mother came to my apartment. She stood in the doorway, eyes red, her coat still damp from the rain. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. I didn't know how deep it went. I made tea, but neither of us drank it. She sat at my kitchen table and held my hand, the way she used to when I had nightmares as a boy. "They'll hate you for this," she said. "Maybe forever." I nodded. "I can live with that." She didn't argue, just squeezed my hand a little tighter, then let go. The next week, the Ellerby name vanished from billboards and news tickers. Properties froze, partnerships dissolved. Marvin tried to sell off his assets, but too many eyes were watching. My father gave a press statement full of denial and deflection. It didn't help. A grand jury was assembled. Investigations deepened. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, surrounded by files, photos, and the notebook I still hadn't put away. No one knocked on my door. No one offered thanks. The silence was complete. But every night I opened Grandpa's letter and read the last line again. Do what you think is right. I couldn't. But maybe you can. And that's when Stein called again, quiet voice, same measured tone, to tell me the will wasn't finished. There was one more part. Harold Stein met me at his office, same leather chairs, same low hum of a ticking clock. He slid a folder across the desk, heavier than paper should be. Your grandfather prepared this separately, he said. Instructions were clear. It was only to be revealed if you followed through. Inside were documents, accounts, property deeds, offshore holdings, quiet investments made decades ago, tech startups, international real estate, silent partnerships. The numbers didn't seem real at first. Then they stacked into something undeniable, $180 million. I stared at the page, then looked up. He never touched any of this, Stein shook his head. He lived off his pension and Social Security. He called this his insurance for integrity. There was a clause, a condition. A third of the estate was to establish a permanent education fund, scholarships, tutoring programs, infrastructure for underfunded schools in counties no Ellerby had ever set foot in. The rest was mine, unrestricted. But even in silence I could hear Grandpa's voice. Use it like someone who understands what it's for. I sat there unable to speak. All the years he spent in a frayed cardigan, sipping instant coffee, listening more than talking, none of it was accidental. He'd chosen to live small, so this moment could live large. When I finally nodded, Stein said nothing. He just closed the folder and handed it to me. I walked out carrying the weight of a legacy I hadn't earned but couldn't walk away from. I knew exactly where I needed to start. I started with the fund. We called it the Ellerby Scholarship, but not for branding, just for clarity. Quietly, steadily, we partnered with community colleges, vocational programs, rural high schools. I hired a team of educators, counselors, and former students who knew what it meant to be overlooked. Grandpa's money began moving through the world not as wealth, but as access. Then I turned to the exhibit. I bought a brick storefront downtown. Modest, nothing flashy. Inside, we built a single room of history, declassified maps, copies of Grandpa's field, reports a replica of the notebook from the cellar. The photo of him in Berlin stood near the entrance. Not as a hero, just as a man who had carried more than he ever said aloud. There was a plaque beneath it. Walter E. Ellerby, Strategic Coordinator, U.S. Intelligence, beloved husband, silent patriot. People came, not many at first, but over time students wandered in, retired veterans, families who never knew what those years looked like from the shadows. Sometimes they asked questions, sometimes they just stared. I never spoke to my cousins again. My father never reached out. Marvin was indicted. My mother sent me a letter on my birthday, no apology, no judgment, just a sentence. He would have been proud. I read it twice and folded it carefully into the back of the notebook. That fall, I stood alone in the center of the exhibit looking at Grandpa's photo. The city moved quietly outside the window, unaware, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel erased. I felt seen.